everybody. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Today we're going deep on something I think a lot of people find kind of intriguing and maybe even a little bit confusing.
Oh, yeah.
The idea of lament in faith. We've got Pastor Janice Doyle's sermon transcript. You sent over some quotes from N.T. Wright and a few other thinkers.
Yeah, some really good stuff.
And I guess what I'm curious about is how do these sources move us beyond simply expressing grief?
Right.
Into actually finding trust in the middle of it.
You've hit on a really key point right away. I think there's this misconception that lament equals complaining.
Yeah.
What I find so fascinating is how these sources frame it as this active spiritual practice.
Okay.
A way to engage with God precisely when things feel really messy.
Okay. So not just like a venting session.
Right.
But something more purposeful.
Exactly. Pastor Doyle really brings us home with her recipe metaphor.
Yeah.
And it's not just that she makes lament approachable, which I think is huge,
Right.
but it's that she highlights the structure of it. Just like a good recipe has steps. Lament moves us from acknowledging the pain to seeking a deeper connection with God within that pain.
You know, I've always struggled with the idea of lament, to be honest with you. It felt almost disrespectful to God.
Right.
Like, shouldn't I just be focusing on gratitude?
Yeah, that's such a common hurdle.
Yeah.
But think about Psalm 13. It starts with, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" King David, this giant of faith, is pouring out raw emotion.
Yeah.
Yet the psalm doesn't end there. It shifts to, "But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation."
Right.
That movement from distress to trust is at the heart of lament.
So it's not denying the hard stuff,
Yeah.
but it's also not getting stuck there.
Right. And Pastor Doyle doesn't shy away from how tough this can be. She really calls lament cathartic. What do you think she means by that?
Well, I guess it's like sometimes you have to voice the pain to even begin figuring out where you stand,
Yeah.
how God fits into it all. Is that kind of what she's getting at?
That's a great way to put it. It's about bringing your whole self to God, mess and all.
Yeah.
And this connects to something you mentioned earlier, the worry about disrespect.
Yeah.
If lament is a form of prayer, does that worry shift when we consider how Jesus himself lamented?
Oh, wow. I hadn't thought of it that way. Pastor Doyle did connect personal lament to Jesus lamenting over Jerusalem, right?
She did?
But I have to admit, that whole image of Jesus as a mother hen always felt a bit sentimental to me.
The sentimentality is definitely there. But think about what emotion it points to.
Okay.
This deep longing for things to be made right.
Yeah.
It's not weak or passive. It's powerful, precisely because even Jesus, fully divine, expressed this depth of sorrow. It shatters the notion that faith equals constant happiness.
So lament actually becomes an example of Jesus modeling authentic faith, even in the face of something awful.
Precisely. And speaking of profound thinkers,
Yeah.
N.T. Wright echoes this. He's adamant that lament isn't whining. He calls it a cry directed to God in the face of a broken world.
Wait, a cry directed to God. How does that change things?
It transforms it from just a venting of frustration into an act of engagement. It's like saying, "God, I see the brokenness. I feel the pain. And I'm bringing it to you because I believe you care."
That's a powerful shift.
Yeah.
It's not about wallowing, but about acknowledging the reality while also clinging to this belief in a God who hears us.
Exactly. And Wright takes it a step further, drawing on Romans 8. He talks about how even when we're speechless, the Holy Spirit groans with us. It's this beautiful image of God being present in our pain, even when we can't articulate it.
Wow, so it's like God is saying, I'm here with you in this, I feel it too. That's incredibly comforting.
It is.
And it seems like both Pastor Doyle and N.T. Wright are really pushing back against this idea that lament equals weak faith.
Absolutely. They're framing it as a courageous act of faith. Think about it. It's way easier to suppress painful feelings,
Right.
to pretend everything's fine.
Yeah.
But choosing to voice our pain, our doubts, our anger, that takes guts. And it's often that raw honesty that allows us to move towards trust and healing.
So lament isn't the opposite of trust. It's almost like the pathway towards it. But I'm still wrestling with this. If it's so important, why does it feel so solitary?
That brings us to a crucial aspect that Pastor Doyle highlights.
Yeah.
The communal nature of lament. We can lament as individuals, yes, but there's also this powerful dimension of lamenting together.
Okay, so it's not just me alone in my room wrestling with God.
Not at all. Think of the early church. They faced persecution, hardship,
Yeah.
and they lamented together. They prayed together, sang together, supported each other through those dark times. That shared experience is incredibly powerful.
So when Pastor Doyle emphasizes being adopted into God's family,
Yeah,
she's also saying we're not alone in our grief. We have each other and we have God.
exactly. We'll dive deeper into the how-to of lament in the next part, but for
Mm,
now, does this reframe how you view expressing those difficult emotions to God?
it certainly does.
Yeah,
And, diving into this idea of communal lament makes me wonder, what are some tangible ways we can actually practice this today?
that's a great question.
Yeah.
And luckily, Pastor Doyle gives us some pretty practical guidance. She actually provides a structure for lament based on the movement we see in Psalm 13.
Oh, right.
She calls it a recipe, which I find really helpful.
I love that. It makes lament feel much less intimidating. So what are the ingredients in this recipe for connecting with God in the midst of pain?
Well, first, she emphasizes addressing God directly.
Okay.
This is the who you're talking to, is acknowledging that you're bringing your pain to the one who cares.
So starting with that direct line of communication, even if it's messy and raw,
hmm
then,
Then comes the heart of lament, voicing your complaint.
okay.
This is where you tell God exactly what's wrong, how you're feeling. No holding back, no sugarcoating.
That's that radical honesty we were talking about earlier, right? Laying it all out there.
Exactly. Like saying, God, this hurts. I'm angry. I'm confused. I don't understand. And Pastor Doyle stresses that you don't need to have all the answers or theological justifications. Just bring the raw emotion.
That's incredibly freeing. It's like permission to be real with God. What comes after we've poured out our hearts to him?
Then she suggests moving into petition.
Okay.
This is where you ask God for what you want him to do. It's acknowledging your need for help, recognizing that you can't do this alone.
So it's not just a venting session, it's also an opportunity to invite God into the situation, to ask for his intervention.
Right.
That's a really important distinction.
It is. And then finally, she emphasizes ending with praise.
Yeah.
This might feel counterintuitive when you're in the depths of pain,
Right.
but it's a powerful act of choosing to trust God even when you don't understand what's happening.
So it's like saying, God, I don't get it, but I trust you. I can see how that could be incredibly difficult,
Yeah.
but also incredibly powerful.
It is. It's a radical act of faith that can lead to a deeper sense of peace and surrender. And, this structure that Pastor Doyle provides is so powerful because it really mirrors the movement we see in Psalm 13. It's that journey from crying out in anguish to resting in God's love.
It's like a roadmap for navigating the emotional terrain of lament, guiding us from the depths of despair to a place of trust and hope. But I have to admit, I'm still wrestling with this idea of praising God when things are falling apart. It feels a bit dissonant.
I understand. It's a tension that Pastor Doyle acknowledges in her sermon.
Yeah.
She talks about how lament isn't a denial of the good things in our lives,
Right.
but a way of carrying our grief alongside the joy we have in Jesus.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's like holding both the pain and the hope, the sorrow and the joy together.
Exactly. And she reminds us that we don't have to have all the answers.
Yeah.
We don't have to force ourselves to feel happy or positive.
Yeah.
We can simply bring our raw emotions to God and trust that he hears us even in the midst of our confusion and doubt.
That's a huge relief. So lamenting doesn't mean ignoring the good things or pretending we're not hurting.
Right.
It's about being honest with God about the full spectrum of our experience.
Right. And it's also about recognizing that lamenting doesn't necessarily change the outcome of our situation. We may not get the answers we're looking for. Our circumstances might not change, but something shifts within us when we choose to lament.
What do you mean? What kind of shift happens?
It's like we're making space for God to meet us in our pain, to comfort us, to strengthen us. We're inviting him into the mess and allowing him to work in ways we may not fully understand.
That makes me think about the communal aspect we discussed earlier. If lament can create that space for God to work in us individually, imagine the potential when we do it together as a community.
Exactly. Remember, Pastor Doyle emphasizes that we don't have to do this alone. We can share our burdens, offer support, and lament alongside one another.
It makes me think about all the ways we could practice communal lament today.
Yeah?
Maybe it's gathering for a special prayer service, sharing our stories in a small group setting, or even just offering a listening ear to a friend who's struggling.
Those are all great examples. And remember, we see this model in the early church. They faced incredible hardship and persecution,
Yeah.
but they didn't face it alone. They gathered together to pray, to sing, to lament, to support one another.
I'm starting to understand how powerful this could be. There's something about shared grief, about knowing we're not alone in our pain, that feels incredibly comforting.
It is. And this reminds me of Paul's letter to the Philippians. He was writing from prison, facing his own suffering and uncertainty. Yet he still encouraged the Philippian church to stand firm in the Lord.
So even in the midst of lament, even when we're wrestling with difficult emotions, we can hold on to hope.
Absolutely. Paul reminds them, and us, that our true citizenship is in heaven, and we have a hope that transcends our present circumstances.
That brings us back to N.T. Wright's idea of lament being a step of faith. It's not about giving in to despair. It's about choosing to engage with God in the midst of our pain, trusting that He's with us every step of the way.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remember that there's no one right way to express lament. It can look different for everyone.
That's so reassuring. So it's not about following a rigid formula. It's about finding what resonates with our own individual experiences and needs.
Precisely. For some, it might be journaling, writing poetry, or creating art. Others might find solace in music, singing hymns of lament, or listening to songs that express the depths of their emotions.
And for some, it might just be sitting in silence, being present with God in their pain and trusting that He hears even our unspoken cries.
Exactly. The important thing is to find what works for you, what helps you connect with God in the midst of your struggles. And to remember that it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to feel sad, angry, confused, overwhelmed.
So we don't have to pretend we have it all together.
Right.
We can bring our messy, imperfect selves to God, trusting that He loves us unconditionally. That's incredibly liberating.
It is. And speaking of freedom, Pastor Doyle makes a really interesting point about lament being a way of releasing control.
Okay.
She talks about her own type B personality and how she struggles with surrendering to God. But she's found that lament allows her to let go of her fears, her worries, her need to fix everything.
Oh, wow. I relate to that so much. I'm definitely a control freak, and the idea of letting go and trusting God is terrifying. But I can see how lament could be a way to practice that surrender.
It is. It's like saying, God, I can't fix this. I
Yeah.
can't control this. I'm giving it to you.
Yeah.
And in that act of surrender, there's a profound sense of freedom and peace.
It's letting go of the need to have all the answers,
Right.
to figure everything out, and simply trusting that God is in control. That's a powerful shift in perspective.
It is. And, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
I'm struck by the complexity of lament.
Yeah.
It's this raw, honest expression of pain and grief. But it's also an act of faith, a way of drawing closer to God, a step towards healing and wholeness.
It really is this paradoxical dance between sorrow and hope, doubt and trust, pain and comfort.
And it's a reminder that even in our darkest moments, God is with us, loving us, holding us, and inviting us to draw near to Him. But that idea of drawing near brings up another question.
So if lament can be this pathway towards deeper trust, how do we move from crying out in pain to actually experiencing that closeness with God? That feels like the real mystery here.
It is a mystery, isn't it?
Okay.
But I think that's part of the beauty of lament.
Yeah.
It's not about having all the answers. It's about being willing to sit in the tension, to wrestle with God, to trust that even in our darkest moments, He's drawing near to us.
That reminds me of something Pastor Doyle said about lament not being about staying stuck in our pain,
Right.
but about moving through it with God's help towards healing and hope. But how do we actually do that? How do we move from lament to trust?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that trust isn't a feeling, it's a choice. It's a decision we make even when our emotions are screaming otherwise. And sometimes the act of lament itself is that first step towards choosing trust.
Okay, so even when I don't feel trusting, I can still choose to act in a trusting way. But how does lament fit into that?
Think about it this way. When we lament, we're acknowledging our need for God.
Okay.
We're saying, God, I can't do this on my own. I need your help.
Yeah.
And that act of surrender, that willingness to let go of control, can actually open us up to experiencing God's presence and comfort in a whole new way.
So it's like by admitting our weakness, our need for God, we're actually creating space for Him to work in our life.
Yes.
That's a pretty counterintuitive idea.
It is. But it's a theme that runs throughout Scripture. Think about the Apostle Paul. He boasted about his weakness because he knew that when he was weak, God's power was made perfect in him.
I'm starting to see how lament can be this incredible tool for spiritual growth. It's not about wallowing in our pain. It's about using it as an opportunity to draw closer to God, to deepen our dependence on Him.
Exactly. And, as we've been talking about all this, I keep coming back to that line from N.T. Wright. Lament is not despair.
Yeah.
It is not whining. It is not a cry into a void. Lament is a cry directed to God.
That image of a direct line to God is really powerful. It reminds me that lament is about engaging with God even in the midst of our pain.
Yes.
It's about having a real, raw, honest conversation with Him, knowing that He hears us and cares.
And I think that's what distinguishes lament from complaining. Complaining often focuses on the problem, on our own helplessness. But lament turns our focus towards God, toward his power and love, towards his ability to work, even in the midst of seemingly impossible situations.
So lament isn't about getting stuck in a cycle of negativity. It's about inviting God into the situation and trusting that he can bring something good out of it, even if we can't see it yet.
Exactly. And I think that's where the communal aspect of lament comes in again. When we lament together, we're reminding each other that we're not alone in our pain, that God is with us, and that there's hope even in the darkest of times.
One of the things that really struck me in Pastor Doyle's sermon was her connection between lament and the idea of being adopted into God's family. It's like, because we're his children, we have the freedom to be honest with him, to bring our whole selves to him, knowing that he loves us unconditionally. That's such a beautiful image. It's like a parent who can handle their child's anger, their frustration, their tears. They don't shy away from those emotions. They embrace them. They comfort. They love. And in the same way, God welcomes our lament. He doesn't turn away from our pain. He draws near to us in it.
That's incredibly reassuring. It makes me think of the image of Jesus lamenting over Jerusalem. It shows us that God isn't afraid of our emotions.
Right.
He feels them too. He weeps with us, he grieves with us, he suffers with us. And somehow knowing that makes it a little easier to trust him even when we don't understand what he's doing.
It does, doesn't it? And as we wrap up this deep dive into the power of lament, I hope you're walking away with a sense of permission to be real with God, to bring your whole self to him, even the messy parts. Because it's in those messy parts, those raw and vulnerable places, that we often find the deepest connection and the most profound healing.
I know, I am. This conversation has been so eye-opening for me. It's helped me see lament not as a sign of weakness, but as a powerful act of faith, a way of drawing closer to God in the midst of pain and uncertainty. And I hope it's also given you some practical tools for incorporating lament into your own spiritual practice. Whether it's using Pastor Doyle's recipe for prayer, finding solace in communal lament, or simply being more honest with God about what's going on in your heart. I encourage you to explore what works for you and to embrace the transformative power of lament.
So, dear listener, as we leave you today, we want to leave you with this question. What step will you take today to invite God into your pain? What emotion, what situation might be calling for this kind of honest, heartfelt conversation with him? Maybe it's time to dust off that recipe for lament and give it a try. You might be surprised by where it leads you, by the depth of connection and healing you find on the other side. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep the faith. It certainly does.